Good Monday morning of the first week in Ordinary Time. So this is the Monday following the Epiphany. And it's the beginning of the church year. So we go for the next 30-something weeks, okay? And this is what it starts with. It's an interesting start to the first because it gives you the call. It starts with the calling of the apostles and the calling of Samuel, the birth of Samuel in the book of Samuel. In every instance, it isn't a push, it's a call. And I think that's extremely important. Especially, I think, as you'll see later, all week long in Samuel, where his mother Hannah, who is barren, okay, but in a very special way, is called to fertility to her husband. Her husband, obviously, Elkanah, or Alcana, I don't know how to say his name. So he's a special birth. He's called specially into existence, Samuel, okay? Actually through natural birth, obviously. But he's still called to be special. And we all are. There is nobody who is not called that way. But in some instances, you're more aware of it. It's the call, I would say the call of love when you get married. That's a vocational call. You see, providentially. I also think of the call to ministry. I have to say that because it stands out here in the calling of the apostles and those of us who follow in the footsteps of the apostles in the ministry of the church. That's a special vocational call. And I have to say, I thought about this a fair amount this morning, long before I read this, long before I sat down to do this, I was thinking about it. My niece, at least Michelle, about 30 years ago, maybe more, 35 years ago, as a young woman, she said to me, Uncle Raymond, why did you become a priest? And I said to her, I felt called. And that's the only answer I could give. It was nothing that I desired at all. When I think of the apostles, they're professional fishermen. They're out doing their job. They're married men. John isn't, but Peter is, and Andrew is. They're married men. I don't know if they had kids or not, but all I know, they were married. Peter for sure, because they talk about his mother-in-law, okay? And they're out doing their thing. They're out fishing. They're professional fishermen. So they're living their ordinary lives. They are ordinary men doing ordinary things in the normal course of ordinary life, you see? And yet they're called upon which they're called to ground and to build the church, to follow Christ. And what does he do? Does he order them? He doesn't command them. He invites them. He said, follow me. And they leave everything to follow him. And that is really the nature of a vocation, at least in certain very specifics. I think everything's a vocation. But in terms of ministry, especially the priesthood, religious life and the priesthood, I think there is something uniquely special, not about the person called, but about the calling. It's because very few, well, I can't speak for everyone. I just know that it wasn't in my interest. Not in mine at all. That was the last thing I wanted. And that somebody stuck it in my head. And I was only about an 8th grader at the time. I was at day camp, okay? And this guy, Bob Bruner. I must have been pretty good in reflecting on things religious and moral, because he said to me, it was one of those kids debate about something. I don't know what it was, but I must have made a fine-tuning argument. I don't know. Anyway, he says, you ought to be a priest. If he kept his Christmas tree mouth shut, I never would have been it. And he stuck it in my head, and I couldn't shake it. I had no interest in it at all. I didn't look up to the priests in our parish, nothing. And my parents sure the hell didn't. The only person I told was my aunt Anita. And when she told my mother's response was, he's nuts. I mean, that's the truth. He's nuts. They admired it and fostered and supported me after and during and after. But they didn't encourage it. Not at all. I don't know. We're Tuscans. There's a deep anti-clericalism that runs in the Tuscan people. Okay, you have to know that we did not put priests on the pedestal at all. Some of the other Italian provinces sure did, and the Sicilians and the Neapolitans, I think. That's what I see. But the Tuscans, not so much. They were really kind of neo-pagans in this Christian dress. Whatever. It certainly wasn't fostered. But I felt called. I put it off as long as I could. In fact, I had one of the best dates of my life was right before I left for the seminary. Weeks before. My friend Al, his sister Barb. Boy, was I nuts about Barbara. She's 2 years younger than I am. We went to the movies to see a boxing match between Floyd Patterson and Ingemar Johansson. Johansson beats him in the first round by a sucker punch to the head. But it was crossing the green in New Haven. It was rainy. It was misty. It was romantic beyond belief. Oh, gosh. And we went to this movie, okay, to see. It was live theater. Okay, it was live. They were broadcasting the fight. That stuck with me. And I saw a bar. I've seen it, of course, off and on all the time for the last 60 years. But they're friends. But she said it was a great date, wasn't it? Yeah, it was. And she used to write to me all the time in the seminary. If you asked me what I wanted the most, was a letter from Barb. I'd tell you the truth. Priesthood was what I was called to, not what I wanted. When I made a retreat as a junior in high school with the Passionists, that I powerfully felt called to. That was the first time I found it attractive. Sacrificial, but attractive. These were hero types to me. I still do. I still see it that way. So I felt even more powerfully called to religious life, especially to the Passionist way of life. And the adventure began. And you see what is the mystery of the calling, and you get it in the reading. Do you think that the apostles, Peter and Andrew, James and John, had any idea what following Christ, hearing that calling, was going to entail? Did you know what you were getting into when you got married and had children? You enter into a graced mystery. A mystery of grace and a graced mystery. An adventure. That's what I tell my kids in class. And life is an adventure. Because you really can't control it. You think you set yourself in motion following what is the ordinary things, and in my case, like religious life, etc. But the way it turned out, was beyond my wildest imagination. It's an adventure of grace. And I think when I drove out here in 1971 to go to grad school at St. Louis U, I thought I'd be here 3 years and go back to Jamaica and teach in our monastery. I've been here 50 years, with 13 years in between in Louisville, teaching. Who would have believed it? Who would have ever guessed it? Who wouldn't even dreamt it? And yet the adventure continued, and it was with the support of my superiors. When I was completing my doctorate, Father Norbert Dorsey was the number 2 guy in the outfit in my province. Said to me, Ted, go out and find your job. They'd had nothing for me back east. Normally you go back and you just go back in the monastery. He said, go out and find your job. That's what I did. I went to Bellarmine College in Louisville, which I heard about because the Western Passionists used to go there, and I thought it was a world-class institution. It wasn't. It was a simple Catholic college in the South. And I discovered marvelous colleagues. I published there, and I became a chairman. And out of that, which was an accident, nobody else wanted the job, I returned to SLU for 28 years and became chairman here. I must hold a record for being chair. Who would have guessed it? I've helped out in the same parish, St. Tim's, St. Mark's, for 50 years. Who would have guessed it? The furthest thing from my mind. When I came to Timmy's, all I wanted was a roof over my head. Instead, I have 50 years legacy there. 4 generations of people. Who would have guessed it? See? That's the calling. St. Peter and Andrew, they didn't know what they were getting into, but they heard the voice of Christ calling them. The voice of Christ called me the priest who came from Bruner, that guy Bob Bruner, the 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid, okay, in a day camp. Just a flipping remark that got into my system, and I couldn't shake it. Believe me, I wanted to. The last thing I wanted to do was be a priest, and yet I have been. You see, that's the mystery of the vocation. That you're seeing it here played out. That Hannah know what kind of a son she would have. That Samuel will be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of the prophets. Huh? No, just glad to have a kid. You see, huh? That Peter and Andrew, that John and James have any idea the adventure that they would live and the church that they would build. None. And yet so it is. Great adventure, grace and mystery, beauty and sadness, but a great story of life, the holiness of life itself, called by God in very, very mysterious ways, deeply personal, but mysterious.